Shaq was enjoying his meal when a wealthy woman's voice sliced through the diner like a blade. She doesn't deserve that money. The room froze. Conversations died. Every eye in the place turned toward the scene unfolding before them. Mia stood stiff, gripping the $1,000 tip Shaq had left her hands shaking. But before she could react, the woman lunged forward and snatched the cash right out of her hands. Gasps rippled through the diner. A cook nearly dropped a pan. Nobody could believe what was happening. Shaq, however, he didn't move. He simply leaned back, arms crossed, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Because he had already decided how this was going to end. What happened next? It shattered egos, flipped the script, and turned this entitled woman's world upside down. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you absolutely speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The entire diner fell into stunned silence. Mia's hands trembled as she lifted the thick stack of crisp $100 bills from under the plate. Her breath hitched. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some cruel joke. It was real. Minutes earlier, Shaquille O'Neal had walked into the diner, ducking slightly as he squeezed through the tiny doorway. The place was old, the kind that smelled like burnt coffee and maple syrup, but it had a warmth to it until Shaq entered. His towering frame, his sheer presence sucked the air out of the room. Conversations died. Silverware clinked against plates. Even the cook in the back peeked through the kitchen window. Mia had noticed him instantly, but she didn't react like the others. No excited whispers, no camera sneaking from her apron pocket. She just grabbed a menu, forced a tired smile, and walked over. "Morning, sir. What can I get you?" Her hands shook slightly as she held out the menu. Shaq glanced at her, really looked at her. Dark circles under her eyes. A uniform with a small tear near the sleeve. Shoes so worn down they barely had soles left. He could tell. She was running on fumes. Still, Mia never faltered. Even when a group of businessmen snapped a picture of Shaq from the next booth, even when a grumpy old man waved her off rudely, she stayed kind, patient, professional. She treated Shaq like just another customer, not like a walking ATM. Shaq placed his order, a simple stack of pancakes, extra syrup. She brought it hot and fresh, refilled his coffee before he even had to ask. And when the bill arrived, Shaq slid a thick stack of cash under his plate. Mia spotted it as she reached for his dishes. She froze. $1,000? This was rent. This was groceries. This was hope. Her throat tightened. I can't take this." Then a sharp voice sliced through the air. "Oh, yes, you can't." Mia flinched as a woman in expensive heels stormed toward the table, her face twisted in rage. The woman's voice dripped with entitlement. "People like you don't deserve that kind of money." Mia flinched, clutching the stack of bills to her chest as the woman stomped closer. The diner, already quiet, felt suffocating now. Conversations had stopped. Even the sizzle of bacon from the kitchen seemed muted. The woman, Patricia, later known as the ultimate Karen, stood tall in her designer heels, her manicured nails tapping against her overpriced purse. Her eyes, filled with disgust, locked onto Mia like she was something filthy that had crawled onto Shaq's table. Shaq, meanwhile, didn't move. He leaned back, arms crossed, watching, studying. Patricia scoffed, gesturing toward the money. "This is a scam." She saw a rich man and turned on the waterworks. Classic Mia's face burned red. "I didn't—" "Oh, please," Patricia snapped, cutting her off. "You don't even work hard. Serving food isn't real work." Mia swallowed hard. This wasn't the first time she'd heard something like that. But this time, it cut deeper. Because it wasn't just about her. It was about her survival. Shaq exhaled slowly, still silent, still watching. He'd seen this kind of person before. The type who thrived on belittling others, who saw kindness as weakness. Mia took a shaky breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "I didn't ask for this," she said softly. "He left it because he wanted to." Patricia's eyes flashed with fury. "Oh, I bet he did," she hissed. "But don't worry, I'll fix that." Then, before anyone could react, Patricia snatched the money right off the table. "I'll take that," she declared, stuffing the bills into her purse. Gas erupted from the diners. The cook peeked from the kitchen, wide-eyed. Mia froze in shock. Shaq, for the first time, uncrossed his arms. His deep voice rumbled through the diner. "Put it back, now!" Patricia froze mid-motion. her fingers still clutching the cash. The smug confidence on her face flickered, replaced with something else. Uncertainty. Realization. She had just challenged the wrong man. A tense, silent, settled over the diner. The air felt electric, charged with an unspoken warning. The other customers held their breath, their gazes darting between Shaq's stone-cold expression and Patricia's suddenly nervous stance. Then just as quickly, she snapped back into character. Patricia let out an awkward, high-pitched laugh, flipping her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Oh, come on," she said, voice sugary sweet. "I was just making sure she wasn't stealing from you." Mr. O'Neill Shaq didn't blink, didn't move. "Lady, that tip was for her." His voice was low, firm, final. Mia, still shaking, hesitantly reached for the money, but Patricia yanked it back at the last second. "Unbelievable," she scoffed, shaking her head. "Do you really think a girl like her deserves this kind of money?" Mia's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but her throat felt too tight. Shaq's expression darkened. "What exactly do you mean by a girl like her?" Patricia faltered for just a second, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. "Oh, please," she rolled her eyes. "Look at her, struggling, probably making minimum wage. You think throwing $1,000 at her is going to change that? She'll be back here in a week, still broke, still pathetic." Mia sucked in a breath, the words hitting harder than she expected. Shaq's jaw clenched. His massive hands tightened into fists. Patricia noticed the shift. For the first time, a hint of fear flashed across her face. Then, without warning, her face twisted in fury. "You ungrateful little brat!" And before anyone could react, a loud slap echoed through the diner. Mia's head snapped to the side. The entire restaurant went deathly silent. Mia's head snapped to the side, the force of the slap sending a sharp sting across her cheek. A deep, searing heat spread across her skin, and when she lifted a trembling hand to touch the spot, she could already feel the swelling beginning. Her breath caught in her throat as the entire diner sat in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on the air like a heavy fog. Somewhere behind the counter, a cook fumbled with a pan, sending it clattering onto the floor with a loud metallic crash that made everyone jump. A few customers gasped audibly, while others simply stared, their mouths slightly open, struggling to comprehend the scene unfolding before them. The murmur of casual conversation that had once filled the small space had vanished, replaced by an eerie, suffocating stillness. Mia's eyes, wide and glistening with shock, slowly lifted to meet Patricia's. The older woman stood tall, her manicured fingers still curled from the impact, her breathing rapid and uneven. For a moment, something almost like regret flickered across her face, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the same smug, entitled look she had worn since she first stormed over to the table. "You needed that," Patricia said, her voice firm, though there was an edge of nervousness beneath her forced confidence. "Maybe next time, you'll show some respect to people who actually work hard for their money." The words barely registered. Mia's ears were ringing, her mind still reeling from the suddenness of the blow. She had dealt with rude customers before, condescending businessmen, impatient diners, people who barely saw her as human, but never, not once, had someone hit her. The air shifted, and Mia suddenly became aware of something else. A deep, low sound rumbled through the room, almost imperceptible at first, like the distant roll of thunder before a storm. It wasn't loud, it wasn't rushed, but it was filled with something far more dangerous, controlled fury. She turned her head slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Shaq was no longer leaning back in his seat. His once relaxed posture was gone, replaced by something rigid and tense. His massive hands, which had been casually resting on the table just moments ago, were now clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles had gone white. His jaw was locked, his lips pressed together in a tight, unyielding line. Patricia seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that she had severely miscalculated. The smug arrogance in her expression faltered, her confidence cracking just enough for a flicker of uncertainty to slip through. Shaq inhaled deeply, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, deliberate motion. Then, with the weight of an unspoken warning hanging heavy in the air, he began to move. The leather seat creaked beneath him as he shifted, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet room. Every pair of eyes in the diner followed him, the anticipation thick enough to choke on. Patricia took a step back without thinking, her expensive heels clicking against the tile floor as a flicker of fear danced behind her eyes. Then, as if delivering a verdict that had already been sealed, Shaq rose to his full height, towering, unshaken, unstoppable, his deep, commanding voice cut. Of awe and determination, Kendrick left the courtroom with his briefcase in hand, his thoughts already forming a plan. This was no longer about a property tax adjustment or even the fine. This was about something much larger, something he couldn't ignore. As Kendrick exited the courtroom, the crisp air outside offered no relief from the tension that still clung to him. The courthouse buzzed with the mundane movements of everyday proceedings. But inside Kendrick's mind, a decision was solidifying. He paused for a moment on the courthouse steps, staring at his phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for his assistant U.S. attorney. Back at the office, no. He muttered to himself. Not yet. He stepped aside to review his notes again. The interactions he had witnessed and experienced in Judge Whitman's courtroom painted a clear picture. The disparity wasn't incidental, it was structural. Kendrick's legal instincts told him he now had the seeds of a much larger case, one that went beyond property taxes or even his personal treatment back in his car. Kendrick opened his briefcase, pulling out his badge and credentials. The federal prosecutor's emblem embossed in gold reflected the sunlight streaming through his windshield. He decided this would be the first move by the time he re-entered the courtroom. Most of the morning cases had concluded. The room was quieter, though a few stragglers remained flipping through papers or waiting for their turn. Judge Whitman was leafing through documents, his demeanor calm but visibly tired. Kendrick walked confidently toward the bench, his badge and identification in hand. As he approached the podium, the court clerk raised her eyes, her fingers pausing mid-type. Judge Whitman glanced up, his irritation returning almost instantly. "Mr. Robinson, the court session has concluded. If you have further business, you'll need to schedule an appointment," the judge said curtly. "With respect, Your Honor." Kendrick began, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "I believe it's important to formally introduce myself." He held his badge up slightly, making sure it was clearly visible to everyone in the room. "I'm Kendrick Robinson, Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of South Carolina. I've been with the Department of Justice for over a decade, focusing on cases of human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations." The judge froze, his hands stilling over the papers he was handling. The color drained from his face as Kendrick's words registered around the room. The remaining spectators watched intently, their expressions a mix of curiosity and anticipation. "I was late this morning because of an urgent federal case requiring my immediate attention." Kendrick continued, his tone firm but respectful. "And while I understand the importance of court procedures, I couldn't help but notice the disparity in how cases were handled here today." The judge's lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Robinson, if you feel there was a procedural issue, you're welcome to file a formal complaint. I've already begun documenting the events of this morning," Kendrick replied, holding up his notebook. "Not just my own treatment, but the differing responses to other latecomers, particularly along racial lines. As an officer of the court, I'm obligated to report any patterns of bias or discrimination I encounter." Judge Whitman leaned back in his chair, clearly uneasy. "Are you accusing this court of misconduct?" "Mr. Robinson, I'm stating what I observed, Your Honor," Kendrick said calmly. "As a federal prosecutor, I've dedicated my career to ensuring justice is applied, equally regardless of who stands before the bench. What I witnessed today raises serious concerns." The silence in the room was deafening. The court clerk glanced nervously between Kendrick and the judge, her hands hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. The young law student in the back corner was furiously jotting notes, her eyes wide with fascination. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "This court takes such matters seriously. If you believe there was an error in judgment, I suggest addressing it through the appropriate channels." Kendrick placed his badge and identification on the podium. "I intend to, Your Honor. But I also believe this moment presents an opportunity for reflection on how we ensure that the principles of fairness and equality are upheld in every courtroom." Judge Whitman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He had presided over this courtroom for decades, his authority rarely questioned so directly. For the first time, it seemed, his confidence faltered. "You may go, Mr. Robinson," the judge said, his voice quieter now. Kendrick collected his credentials and turned to leave, but not before offering one final statement. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll ensure this is addressed properly." As Kendrick walked out of the courtroom for the second time that morning. He felt the eyes of every remaining spectator on his back. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on him. This wasn't. Already seen it in real time, now recoiled at the sheer violence of the moment. The cook who had dropped his pan earlier muttered, "Damn, she really did that." The officers watched the screen, their expressions unreadable. When the clip ended, the taller cop exhaled, shaking his head. He turned to Patricia with an almost bored expression, like he had seen too many people like her before. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault and theft." Patricia's eyes bulged. The blood drained from her face so fast it looked like she might faint. "What? No!" She clutched her purse to her chest as if the money inside could somehow protect her. "You can't do this. I'm the victim. She set me up. This is all a misunderstanding." The shorter officer stepped forward, pulling out his handcuffs. "Ma'am, turn around." Patricia took a frantic step back, her expensive heels slipping slightly against the tile floor. "Wait, you don't understand. I was just trying to—" Shaq, who had been silent, finally spoke. He crossed his arms over his massive chest, his voice low, firm, and utterly final. "Nah, lady, you just got exactly what you deserve." The moment the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around Patricia's wrists, the tension in the diner finally snapped. For a long, agonizing moment, no one moved. Then, applause erupted. It started with one person, then another. Within seconds, the entire diner was clapping, some customers even cheering as Patricia was dragged toward the exit by the officers. A man at the counter whistled. A group of teenagers in the back pulled out their phones, already recording as Patricia shrieked, twisting against the officer's grip. "You have no idea who I am," she screeched, her voice rising to an almost unbearable pitch. "I will sue this entire place. I will ruin all of you." The officer holding her side, clearly done with the theatrics. Yeah, you can explain all that downtown." Shaq, who had been watching silently, finally exhaled and sank back into his seat. His presence had been heavy, towering, unshakable. But now, he looked completely at ease. He glanced up at Mia, who was still standing beside the table, her hands trembling slightly. She had barely moved since the slap, her body still locked in the shock of it all. The red mark on her cheek had faded a little, but the sting, both physical and emotional, still lingered. Shaq tapped the table, bringing her attention back. His expression softened. "Now, where were we?" Mia blinked, then let out a shaky laugh, swiping at her damp eyes. She still couldn't believe what had just happened. Patricia, the nightmare in heels, was gone. The weight she had been carrying for the last 15 minutes, or maybe even longer than that, was slowly lifting. She nodded, her voice still a little unsteady. "Right, pancakes." Shaq grinned. "Pancakes." The diner settled back into its normal rhythm, the distant sound of a spatula scraping against the grill, the low murmur of conversations picking back up. But just as Mia turned toward the kitchen, a voice called out from behind her. "Mia, can I talk to you for a second?" She turned, startled, as the manager rushed toward her, a strange look on his face. For a moment, Mia's stomach twisted in knots. Her manager never called her aside unless something was wrong. She had barely processed what had just happened. And now this? Her mind raced. Was she about to get fired? Had Patricia's meltdown somehow put her job on the line? She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Yeah, she said hesitantly, wiping her hands on her apron as she followed him toward the back of the diner. The manager, a stocky man in his 40s with a permanently stressed expression, ran a hand through his thinning hair. He let out a long sigh before turning to face her. "Mia, I need to say something." Mia braced herself. This was it. The moment he told her they couldn't have incidents like this in the diner, that even though Patricia was clearly in the wrong, they couldn't afford bad press. She had seen it happen before, victims being punished just to keep things civil. The manager exhaled sharply. "I should have stepped in earlier." Mia blinked. "Wait, what?" He shook his head, looking almost embarrassed. "I saw what was happening, and I froze. I thought maybe it would blow over, and I wouldn't have to get involved. But that was wrong. I should have backed you up the second she started yelling at you." Mia opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had never expected an apology. Her manager sighed again, rubbing the back of his neck. "And because of that, I want to make it right." He looked her in the eye. "I want to promote you, Mia." Mia felt her entire body go still. Wait, what? Shift supervisor. He nodded firmly. You've been here longer than most of the staff. You work harder than anyone. And after what I saw today, you deserve it. Mia's throat tightened. She barely made enough to scrape by as it was. A promotion meant more hours, better pay. It meant stability. Her eyes welled up again, but this time, it wasn't from fear or humiliation. It was hope. Are you serious? She whispered. Before the manager could answer, a deep voice rumbled from behind her. Shaq, still seated at his booth, grinned and winked. See, he said, taking a sip of his coffee. Good people always win in the end. Mia was still trying to process the promotion when she heard the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. She turned just in time to see Shaq rising from his booth, his massive frame towering over the diner, like a giant preparing to leave his kingdom. She had already been given more than she ever expected today. Justice, respect, a chance at a better life. But something about the way Shaq was looking at her told her he wasn't done yet. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a thick, neatly folded envelope. Without a word, he extended it toward her. Mia frowned, hesitating. What's this? Shaq simply nodded at it. Go ahead, open it. Her fingers trembled as she peeled back the flap, her breath catching the moment she saw the crisp stacks of $100 bills neatly tucked inside. She blinked rapidly, convinced her eyes were deceiving her. But no, this was real. $5,000. Her throat tightened, a lump forming so fast it nearly choked her. I can't take this, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. That's what you said last time. Didn't work then either. Mia felt the first tear slip down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, but it was useless. The dam had already broken. Her shoulders shook as silent sobs racked her body. This money wasn't just paper. It was rent. It was groceries. It was a way out of the constant, suffocating struggle she had been trapped in for years. Shaq placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his deep voice warm and steady. You work hard. You deserve good things too. Mia was still trying to find the words when Shaq turned toward the door. He took a step away before pausing, glancing back with a knowing grin. Now go buy yourself some new shoes, all right? And with that, he walked out, leaving Mia standing in the middle of the diner, crying, laughing, and holding the single greatest gift she had ever received. A week later, Mia's life looked completely different. The cramped, leaky studio apartment she had barely survived in for years, gone. She had signed a lease for a modest but clean one-bedroom across town where the heat actually worked and the ceiling didn't threaten to cave in every time it rained. The stress of overdue rent notices and collection calls, gone. The moment she deposited Shaq's money into her account, she paid off her debts, feeling lighter than she had in years. And work? Work had changed in a way she never imagined. She stood behind the counter of the diner, but this time she wasn't just taking orders. She was giving them. As the new shift supervisor, she had swapped her tattered apron for a fresh uniform, her old, worn-out sneakers replaced by a brand new pair that actually had soles intact. Customers treated her differently now, not just because her name tag said supervisor, but because they had seen what happened. The entire town had. The security footage of Karen's slap, the arrest, Shaq's quiet but powerful intervention, it had gone viral overnight. People streamed into the diner, not just for pancakes, but to shake Mia's hand, to tell her they had been rooting for her. Karen, on the other hand, still facing charges. The city wasn't about to let her walk away after what she had done, and with thousands of online commenters calling for justice, the case had only gained momentum. Meanwhile, across town, a reporter caught up with Shaq outside a gym, shoving a microphone toward him. Shaq, any thoughts on the viral diner incident? The internet is calling you a hero. Shaq paused, adjusting the towel slung over his shoulder. He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. Man, I just did what was right. The reporter pushed for more, but Shaq was already walking away, leaving behind the same effortless kindness that had changed Mia's life forever. Good people deserve good things. Mia sat by the window of her new apartment, fingers curled around a warm cup of coffee, watching the sun cast golden streaks across the city skyline. The world outside bustled as it always did, cars honking, people rushing, the distant hum of life moving forward. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't just surviving it, she was a part of it. A deep breath filled her lungs, steady and slow, as she let her thoughts drift back to the whirlwind of the past week. The diner, the slap, the arrest. Every moment replayed in her mind like a scene from a movie she couldn't believe she had starred in. At first, she had struggled to make sense of it all. How had a single encounter, just a normal day at work, turned into the turning point of her entire life? But the answer was simple. It was kindness. Shaq had seen her, really seen her, not as just another overworked waitress, not as someone invisible, but as a human being who deserved good things. And he had acted, not with grand speeches, not for attention, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That truth sat heavy in her chest, its warmth spreading through her like sunlight. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about one lucky moment or one generous person. It was about the way she had always treated people, with patience, with warmth, with an unshaken belief that everyone deserved respect, even when they didn't give it in return. For so long, she had believed that kindness was something given without expecting anything back, that life didn't always reward the people who did the right thing. But now she had proof that sometimes kindness does come full circle. Her phone buzzed on the table, the screen lighting up with a new notification. She picked it up and felt her breath catch in her throat. 50 million views, the video of Karen's downfall, the slap, the stolen money, the way justice had unfolded right there in the diner, had spread across the world. The comments were flooded with people cheering for Mia, praising Shaq, and celebrating the moment where, for once, the right people won. Setting the phone down, she leaned back in her chair, a soft smile curving her lips. The world hadn't changed overnight. Life wasn't suddenly perfect, but for the first time in a long time, she truly believed in something she had once doubted. Good people deserve good things. And finally, she was ready to believe she was one of them.